Hello, and thanks for joining us today for this ITProTV webinar. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box throughout the webinar, and we will answer as many as we can at the end. You will receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. Now let's get started.
Hello and welcome to the ITProTV webinar series live from the ITProTV studios. I'm your moderator for today, Peter Van Rysdam, and I'm here with Adam Gordon and Mike Rodrick, today's presenters. Adam is an edutainer here at ITProTV, teaching courses across a wide range of disciplines like cybersecurity, cloud, and Microsoft. He's trained IT workers around the world. Mike is also an edutainer for ITProTV, where he focuses on Microsoft topics like Windows 10 and 11, Windows Server, and Azure. And if you like what you see here today, you'll be happy to hear that this is the format for all the ITProTV courses. So what exactly is ITProTV? It's a place that you can watch and learn. We offer an engaging way to learn and grow your career. Whether you're just starting out or you're a seasoned IT pro, we've got the courses to meet your needs. CompTIA, Cisco, Linux, Apple, Microsoft, security, cloud, service management, and more. All online, all on demand. Check us out over at ITPro.tv. All right, we want to hear from you today, so you're encouraged to ask questions. If you send in a question today, you'll be entered to win an ITProTV t-shirt, much like this one here. If you're watching on GoToWebinar, put your question in the questions panel. LinkedIn Live viewers, drop them in the chat. And if you're watching on the ITProTV on-air page, thanks for being a member. You can put your questions in the chat as well. All right, Adam and Mike, let's get started with today's topic, Azure Virtual Desktop versus Windows 365. Which is right for you? Welcome to the show, guys.
Hey, thanks, Peter.
Hey, everybody.
All right, well, let's get started with just kind of a basic question and kind of get us rolling, and we'll go from there. So what does Windows 11 mean for my organization? I know it's coming out really soon, so this is the time to start thinking about that.
So, Mike, you want to go first?
Yeah, after you, sir.
Oh. Well then, so it is actually coming out really soon. It's actually available now in preview. It's going to be available almost it's officially supposed to be available October 5th. It's actually already available for you to start installing and playing with. But what it means for your organization is several things. If you are an individual, maybe a small business owner and or a worker in a small business, it may mean you're going to get Windows 11, as many of us will, through a scheduled update from Microsoft if your machine meets minimum hardware requirements. And that is something that will happen just like Windows updates happen today, meaning in theory, seamlessly, and you don't have to do much of anything, maybe nothing at all, depending on the version of Windows 10 you're currently running and the kind of hardware you have. And it is the true essence of what we call operating system as a service, which we're going to expound on in this webinar and talk about as desktop as a service. But for many of us, it's going to mean really just a seamless upgrade experience. But if you're in a small to medium, medium to large, or enterprise-sized business, and you have a centralized IT function, which is controlling desktop administration, but also deployment, refresh, upgrades, and maintenance, it's going to mean planning and a scheduled rollout that may take several phases and will involve different technology platforms. So it really depends on where you're coming from, but ultimately it's Microsoft's look ahead to the future, the latest and greatest version of a desktop OS, but one that positions us to be fully managed in an as-a-service world and to attach to the cloud and be managed and secured through the cloud as hallmarks of what this operating system provides.
All right, Adam, you kind of mentioned the date there, so I'm curious, if I'm not ready yet, maybe I need to test some things on my end at my company, do I have to upgrade or deploy on that date, or can I pause that automatic download from happening?
Yes. We could do it either or both. We can choose to deploy almost immediately or immediately once the operating system becomes available through different channels, depending on whether you're doing a long-term service branch, you're doing a Windows Insider preview, you're buying retail through a retail channel, maybe Best Buy or a distribution channel such as that in retail, or you have a LAR or a VAR, a licensing provider that's going to sell you licenses, or maybe deploy a pre-made image. So you do have options, but you can actually grab that image, do a deployment, do an upgrade yourself. You can have Microsoft do it for you, or again, depending on the circumstances and the way in which you currently manage desktops in your organization, you have the ability to use all the current technologies, System Center Config Manager, with or without cloud attached into Endpoint Configuration Manager, which is what we now see as Intune and potentially the cloud attached version of Configuration Manager in a hybrid environment. We have the ability to do this through Windows Software Update Services through WSUS. So we can defer those deployments the way we have been able to historically in other versions of the OS. and defer that for days, weeks, months, or even years beyond the initial release date, depending on our planning and our capability cycle in terms of hardware refresh.
Hey, before I move on to the next topic, I did have a question on something you said there, Adam. You said, you might have a company that sells you licenses. This is a free upgrade, right? Or is that different for business?
So it is free in many areas. Free is a relative stretchy and elastic term, as you're going to probably hear Mike and I both talk about as we get into the discussion around desktop as a service. We typically are bundling the operating system as part of the cost of using a platform like Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365 going forward. So we're paying for it, but we just don't see it as an upfront cost. It's kind of hidden in the details. So in that respect, it is not free. You do pay for the operating system in one way or another. But if you have Windows 10, a current version of Windows 10 licensed correctly, and are doing the right things and maintaining that, then you are going to be eligible for an upgrade. But there are a lot of people that will buy brand new. New hardware will be required to run Windows 11, and not everybody will have Windows 10 capable hardware that will survive and allow for that upgrade. And as a result, we will see that we may have to purchase new hardware, and potentially as a result, we may be purchasing new operating system licenses as part of that.
Yeah, definitely, that's true. That might be baked into the cost of that new machine, but the specs are different, so you might have to find those changes. So, Mike, I'll put this next one to you. If you do decide that yes, you're ready to deploy, and you've got all the hardware in place and everything, what does that process look like? I know you've done the deployment on the beta, but is it similar to that?
It's a pretty straightforward process, honestly. I mean, it's going to be a Windows update, right? As Adam mentioned earlier, this is going to be rolled out as basically an optional feature. So when you go into Windows updates, you should see the option there if your machine is ready. Now, that's something I don't think we've talked about yet. We talked about this deployment date being in the middle of October, hopefully, right? That's when they're planning on it. But it's not going to be like everybody at once, right? They're going to do a scheduled rollout, and they're going to be looking at hardware, and they've got other algorithms that I don't even pretend to know what they're doing, but they're going to try to figure out how they can roll it out little by little rather than doing everything at once. It's also going to, it's going to depend on whether your hardware is capable of supporting, which the requirements are really pretty slim as far as processor and memory and things like that. It's the TPM, some of those kind of things like the TPM 2.0. Some of your older hardware might not have that, but if your machine supports it and the algorithm decides that it is time for you to enjoy this update, it'll show up in your Windows updates. So you'll have to go in and do your Windows updates, and it won't be automatic. It will be a manual process. So as Adam mentioned, if we're not ready for it, we don't have to, right? We can choose to install it when we get ready. So as far as that goes, as far as like, personal PCs, things like that, you're going to look for it in a Windows update. In organizations, we're waiting for it, and it's already becoming available. As we look out in Azure, they're starting to load up some of the preview images are going to be available to deploy VMs out in Azure. When we get to looking at Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365, we're going to see they're getting ready to push that Windows 11 out to those as well. So depending on how you're deploying it will determine which way or how that's going to work for you. Personal PCs, it'll be a Windows update. Businesses, most of the time, we're going to be managing images.
Yeah, that's a great segue there, because that's what I was going to ask. If we're, we've kind of talked about if I don't want to deploy from my own computer, we don't have to, and here's how you can stop it. But if it's the kind of thing where I don't want it to deploy across my entire network that I am responsible for, is there a different process we have to do? Because, I don't want some employee coming in and maybe hitting yes on that update a little bit too soon before we're ready as a company.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's something we have to think about. It, as Adam mentioned, in our planning phase, and we think about Windows 11 coming out and becoming available. It depends on how you're running your updates, or a lot for your organization. If you're using things like WSUS or managing your updates that way, we can prevent that update from going out to our machines. If it shows up, there's a good chance a user could end up selecting that. So it's going to be a little tricky, right? We're going to have to try to control it through our update process. There is a way we can modify the registry. We can set, if you're using Windows Update for Business, there is a registry key where we can set the target feature update version. And so what we can do is we can go into that registry key, and we can do this through policy, right? So we can apply it to all of our machines across our network or whatever subset of machines we need. And we can specify, say, 21H2, right? That latest version of Windows 10. If that's the target version, then Windows for Business, Windows Update for Business isn't going to try to take us beyond that, right? They're only going to put features for that. They won't offer you that next feature, which is going to be Windows 11.
All right, sounds good. So let's move on now to some of the big topics we wanted to talk about today. Before we kind of dig into Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365, let's kind of talk about this overarching issue. What is desktop as a service? I know it's something I've heard that term thrown around a lot, but I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, Adam, I'll let you go with that one.
Oh, absolutely. So, when we think about desktop as a service, and you heard me talk about it a couple of minutes ago when I was talking about the idea of the operating system as a service, right? This is just another way of considering how we deliver services today. In the cloud, everything, almost without exception today, can be considered to be an as-a-service offering. We have infrastructure as a service. We have all sorts of different capabilities that have spun up in recent years in this category. And the idea of a desktop as a service is no exception. What it really provides for us at the end of the day is the ability to be able to deploy an operating system, in this case, let's say Windows 11, and to do so with all of the profiling and all of potentially the workloads, the applications, and the capabilities that we want, the features, and all of the bells and whistles that operating system should provide. By the way, I'm pushing a petition to have Microsoft bring back NT4 Pinball. I think it was the best video game we ever had in an operating system, and I want to see it in Windows 11. But that aside, we could add all those features, those capabilities, profile the system, package it up, and I'm being overly simplistic when I describe this. Mike and I, take apart the simplicity and really add the detail here as we talk about AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop versus Windows 365 in a couple of minutes. But at a high level, we're talking about pushing all of that out as a package and making it available, and potentially having it available anywhere in the world via the cloud. And hopefully, if it's done the right way, follow you so that you can be logged into that system, your profile, your workloads, your data is all there. And using those supporting cast of characters like Microsoft 365 for a productivity solution, and of course, Azure and Cloud Fabric to be able to provide additional support for backing up and disaster restoration, things like that. We have a complete solution that allows information workers to be productive, but to do so in a managed environment that optimizes their ability to do that securely and minimizes distractions and things that we don't want to deal with, having to do updates and having to worry about latest versioning. All that can be managed and essentially abstracted away with desktop as a service if we choose to.
Very cool. And yeah, I haven't checked if Minesweeper got a user experience update or anything in Windows 11, so it's something I'll have to look out for sure. All right, so let's talk about Azure Virtual Desktop specifically. Is that a type of desktop as a service, or is that more like a virtual machine? Help us understand that.
It is. I'll take that one, Adam. It's Azure Virtual Desktop is a desktop as a service, right? AVD for short. And I'm going to vote for Chip's Challenge, if anybody remembers that.
Oh, good one.
From, I think, Windows 98.
Good one.
I don't remember.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly. But AVD, or Azure Virtual Desktop, is basically virtual desktop infrastructure run in the cloud, right? As a way to provide desktop as a service using Microsoft and Azure as a provider. And if any of you out there have worked with, remote desktop services, terminal services, tried to do VDI in-house in the past, you know how much fun it was, right? How much fun it was to work with, how much fun it was to troubleshoot, keep up and running. This is basically, you're going to take that, put it out there in Azure, let Microsoft handle most of the complexities in their control plane, but still give us plenty of control and the ability to deliver virtual desktops to anybody, anywhere is really I think that might even be one of their slogans, but we're talking about delivering a desktop across the internet to Mac OS, to iOS, to Android, to Windows PCs, right? To just about anything, either using HTML5 or a client built for that particular operating system. So it is desktop as a service. It's just virtual desktop infrastructure out there in the cloud.
And just to clarify, Mike, because I know Microsoft loves to do this where they change the names of things. This was Windows Virtual Desktop before, right?
It was until, in fact, just recently, a few months ago at the time of this filming, it was Windows Virtual Desktop. They updated that name to be a little more reflective of what it really is, I think, to be Azure Virtual Desktop. So you are correct, sir.
Yeah, I bet there's people at home going, wait, I've heard of that. It sounds a lot like Windows Virtual Desktop.
It's funny because a lot of the exam for this one was the AZ-140, but it was the Windows Virtual Desktop, and then right in the middle of that exam being rolled out, they changed the name. But luckily, they just kind of let that slide. If you pass Windows Virtual Desktop, you're now Azure Virtual Desktop certified.
Free certification. There you go. All right, so let's go over to you now, Adam. So on the flip side, what is Windows 365?
So, it's interesting, right? Because as Mike described Azure Virtual Desktop, he hit on this, but he didn't really make, I think, the distinction we have to make to clearly define Windows 365, which is Azure Virtual Desktop is desktop as a service. So is Windows 365, by the way. And both of these are built on top of a virtual machine running in Azure, as Mike suggested and he talked about, absolutely. But the difference here is that AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop, is a semi-managed solution that gives us, as Mike suggested, flexibility as an IT administration group or individual to customize and to really optimize that deployment for our end users, typically in enterprise businesses. Whereas Windows 365 is essentially a non-flexible version of that. You know, we're talking about the difference between ordering off the price fixed menu, you essentially just get it with no substitutions, Windows 365. You take it as Microsoft provides it. There's really no capability to administer and or to change or modify or in any way enhance or perhaps differentiate that service. Whereas with Azure Virtual Desktop, it's an a la carte menu. You get to add options and sides as long as you're willing to pay for and or take on that complexity, because we do expose a lot of the management capabilities that in Windows 365, Microsoft takes over as a fully managed solution, abstracts and says, we're providing everything. All you have to do is simply consume. And so in Windows 365, we have the same desktop as a service, whether it's Windows 10 or Windows 11 ultimately underlying that. And we have the capability to really be targeting small and perhaps even medium-sized businesses that don't tend to have their own on-premises IT management capability. They probably have a lot of end users that are geographically scattered in different places, and it's very hard to provide customized, centralized, or even decentralized management for those users. And so being able to pull a system down that is already fixed and ready to go, and all they have to do is just assign a license, which enables its use, is the way to go. And so Windows 365, as opposed to Azure Virtual Desktop, fits that bill. Both of these solutions, by the way, once they are provisioned, meaning once you set up licensing and through whatever web portal you decide to onboard through, you assign a license and say, I'm ready to go. Takes about an hour to provision and instantiate an instance on average, give or take. And as a result, within about an hour, you've got a fully functional Windows-based desktop that is managed at some level, and users are ready to be productive anywhere in the world, as Mike suggested, across any hardware platform. Minimum hardware requirements, of course, being met, but they can run it on a Mac OS. They can run it over Android. They can run it on Windows. So the underlying hardware itself is not an issue because we just simply put this on top of what is there and we make it available, which means maximum productivity, minimum additional concern, and really as a result, incredible flexibility.
Can you run it on your BlackBerry though, Adam?
I could.
You could. You could. If anyone could, I believe that you could. All right. Well, this is a versus webinar here, so we're looking at them against each other. We kind of want to look at the tail of the tape here. So, by the way, we're going to show some slides. We're going to make these available for you to download. We're going to put a link in the chat in GoToWebinar and in the chat as well on the ITProTV platform and LinkedIn Live, so you don't have to frantically take notes. But let's go ahead and start with the differences or similarities between AVD and Windows 365 architecture.
Mike,
cool.
you want to jump in?
Absolutely. And when we look at this, we'll break it up even more than that, because when we think about Windows 365, what we haven't mentioned yet is there's actually two versions of that Windows 365. There's Enterprise and there's Business. And Enterprise is geared towards, a full-on enterprise where you're deploying this across a large number of users, versus Business is really designed for an individual or a small business that maybe usually goes down to the box store to buy a new laptop when they have an employee. You're not purchasing hundreds or thousands of machines from one of the big vendors. So, and there are some differences. I shouldn't say subtle. There are some big differences between enterprise and business when it comes to Windows 365. And then for Azure Virtual Desktop, we also have to think about personal versus pooled, but not too much. Most of the things we're going to talk about in here are stretch across both of those with Azure Virtual Desktop. So just to clear that up as we go through here. Starting with the control pane, that's the easiest one. It's the same. Right? Because as Adam mentioned, we've had Windows Virtual Desktop, which became Azure Virtual Desktop, which was this enterprise VDI solution, right? And they've just taken that and leveraged that and created this Windows 365 where they can truly do, the streaming desktop as a service and a lot less work if you don't have that same IT staff, but it all runs on the same fabric out there in Azure, right? So when we think about the VMs, the control plane, all the stuff that Microsoft manages, the brokers that handle the sessions, right? All of that is still handled or is the same across Windows 365 or Azure Virtual Desktop. We interact with it through APIs or through the portal or through other means, if it's an end user through their connection to their VM. But the underlying control plane is the same. As we move, I don't know, Adam, if you want to jump in anytime, feel free. When we look at compute cost, as you can see with Windows 365, Microsoft managed fixed cost, no administrative access. And Adam mentioned this, right? These are going to be virtual machines that are running under Microsoft's Azure subscription, not yours. So you don't get control of or direct access to those VMs. We'll talk a little bit about networking here coming up because that's where they kind of split. But as far as the Windows 365, no administrative access, Microsoft managed fixed costs for those. Whereas Azure Virtual Desktop and their compute, it's all about consumption, right? That's how we save money because if we're not using them, we're not getting charged. The less we use, we shut them off. If we have peak usage, that's when we get billed more. So it's customer managed, consumption-based cost. Storage-wise, again, you're going to see kind of a theme here, right? Because of the way it's set up in the background and because of I don't want that administrative effort needed for Windows 365, you'll see this common theme throughout here. Microsoft managed fixed costs, multiple storage sizes, service level disaster recovery, meaning that when we deploy a Windows 365 desktop to a user, we can pick the size, but there are some fixed sizes that we can pick from. Like, do you need 32 gigs, 64 gigs, 128, and you're going to pay accordingly. Whereas with Azure Virtual Desktop Storage, it's all customer managed, right? We can go in and we can choose how big of a disk we want to make for that data disk and add multiple disks to our VMs, and we have full control over that. Easy to back up using all of the tools that Azure has available, and it's, again, usage-based, so it's based on how much storage space we're using. With Windows Virtual Desktop or with Windows 365, you pay for that 64 gigabyte drive. Whether you've got 32 gigs of data on there or more, you're paying the same price. So difference there is fixed cost versus consumption based. As we move into networking, this is where we see a little bit of difference between enterprise and business. With enterprise, the VMs themselves are still going to be running in Microsoft's Azure subscription, so not under our control. But the network adapters for those VMs are actually injected into our subscription. So that's where we see those machines and where we can take those network adapters that are attached to those machines and connect them to our different virtual networks. We have control over routing all of that stuff, getting it back to our tunnel on premises, whatever we need to do. IPs, security, because we have control over the network interface. We'll see that on our end, on our management end. With business, we don't get that. It's not designed for a company that has a big IT staff and can manage all of this, right? It's designed for small businesses and individuals that don't need to or want or have the desire to do that. So you don't get access to even the network adapter, which is good if that's your scenario, but if you need more control, that's not going to work for you. But it's fixed cost, no direct admin access, no flexibility, versus Azure Virtual Desktop. It's all on us, right? We build everything from the ground up. We control all of that. It's all flexible. We can choose what VNets, what network adapters, how many IP addresses, all of that good stuff.
Mike, just before we continue, so probably a good place for me to jump in and make a comparison for a minute. So, one of the things that becomes really apparent here where you dig into the details, and it's apparent in what Mike's talking about, but you have to really be paying attention to the language and see the subtlety here, the difference in Windows 365 between the enterprise, the column on the left near Mike, and the business, the column closer to me in the Windows 365 breakdown, is that even with the networking, and this is really where we get into the cost multiplier with Windows 365, you have to be careful because the business option is essentially a price fixed solution like I suggested. It's a monthly price. There's no additional charges, but you have no flexibility and essentially no management capability. But where you do get flexibility, limited though it is, but it's a very important area of flexibility, in the enterprise model is the virtual network, the VNIC being injected into the VNet that Mike was talking about, gives us management exposure and capability to configure security, routing, we could do peering, we could do dedicated express route, connectivity, things like that. But the challenge is we're not paying for bandwidth, right? So we get billed, as you can see there, based on that cost factor of us using that traffic and consuming that traffic across that network connection. And so we have to really be careful. You have to be really careful as you start planning these deployment options because we are in Azure Virtual Desktop, a full pay-as-you-go model. And so we kind of expect that. But what I find most businesses, as I've been talking to them about these options and starting to plan deployments for customers for Windows 365, is they're not thinking about the fact that there could be additional charges. And depending on the way you go, you're going to get a significant uptick in your monthly expense if you're not careful. So I think it's a really subtle, unfortunately right now, Microsoft really hasn't documented that as clearly, I think, as they need to. But it's also a really important point with regards to how we view these two distinct different offerings. Both of them are great. Both of them are targeted at very specific verticals in terms of the audience profile, but you need to be aware of what you're buying and ultimately what the additional potential charges may be. Mike, I know you wanted to talk a bit about the profiles, the difference between FS Logics and whether it's mandatory or not, and the local profile, as well as the identity, the Azure capabilities around AD join that you and I chatted about before we got started. You want to take us back and continue with that?
Absolutely. So, when we talk about profiles, we understand what a Windows profile is, right? What we really have to think about here with Windows 365, these are not shared environments, right? And that's one of the great things about Azure Virtual Desktop is the ability to do multi-session, right? It's the only place we can get access to that Windows 10 multi-session edition where I can take a VM, give it plenty of resources, and I can have multiple users hitting that VM, logged into it, using it, and I can save costs, right? That helps me reduce my costs because not all my users are power users and need the full resources of that VM. But the issue then becomes profiles, because when we look at pooled environments and even personal to an extent with AVD, we can't store their profile on that VM because they're going to be connecting to, it's a pool of VMs. You never know which one they're going to connect to. FS Logics, and I know this isn't the show for it, but FS Logics is the solution that allows us to move those profiles outside of the VM, store them on basically a VHD, and mount that to whatever VM, whatever session host they connect to, so they always have their profile. It looks local to them, but it doesn't matter which machine they connect to. Fantastic. With Windows 365, these are not shared machines or shared machines, yeah. So you're going to be connecting to that same VM every time. You're licensed for this. You get access to that Windows Virtual Desktop. So your profile is a local profile, just like we would think of on a physical machine. And that's one of the things that they talk about with Windows 365. It's really designed to be managed like you would your physical infrastructure. It's very similar in that respect. Well, in some
Mike,
ways.
we also need that, just a quick addition on the FS Logics piece. So the other thing customers, again, don't realize here is that because of the need to move those profiles out of the PC and essentially put them into a share that's available over the network, we have to mount an SMB share or an NFS share, or we have to have some sort of device running as a NAS device or something, somewhere where we can park those profiles, which means we now have added complexity, added cost, and potentially now added maintenance. And if any of those things go sideways, guess what happens to those user profiles? They don't show up when they're supposed to. So it's a great solution, FS Logics, awesome technology, probably the best of breed that's currently in market for this. But the reality is it's a much more complex solution requiring that level of IT sophistication that larger businesses typically will have, whereas small businesses may not want the headaches of having to worry about maintaining essentially what we used to call roaming profiles, right? In the old on-premises days where you had to maintain your file share to be able to bring those profiles down, right? NTuser.dat, NTuser.man, right? With roaming profiles. And as a result, it can add a little bit of complexity as well as cost into the mix. So another thing to consider as we're talking about the do's and don'ts here.
All right, and then the last thing we want to talk about when it comes to the architecture is identity. When we look at the session hosts, the VMs, right, and how they are joined to our enterprise. As you can see here with the Windows 365 Enterprise, hybrid AD join is required. That means you are going to have either on-premises Active Directory domain services running or Azure AD domain services running. If you're on premises, you're going to need that site-to-site connection, right? You got to take care of the routing and make sure all that can go through there. They are working on Azure AD join so that we can do this without having to run Active Directory domain services, but not yet. And I take that back. I was wrong about that. Azure AD domain services is not supported yet. I think that will be coming. The business is Azure AD join only. So this is a native solution for those. Again, it's not in your you don't manage any of this, right? It's all done kind of behind the scenes. So it's natively joined to Azure AD. With Azure Virtual Desktop, again, Active Directory Domain Services is required. They are working on adding Azure AD join capabilities. I think, Adam, you mentioned that this was in preview right now?
It is currently, they're in preview right now, public preview as of the beginning of September. So we'll see it as a GA capability, I'm guessing, before the end of the year, most likely.
Very good. All right, so that takes care of the differences, I think, most of the differences there between Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop from the architecture standpoint.
All right, perfect. And I know a lot of the IT admins that are watching this were looking down that list saying, okay, this is managed by Microsoft, this is managed by me, this is managed by Microsoft. So can you kind of give us the IT admin perspective a little bit and dig a little bit deeper into what falls on them versus what falls on Microsoft?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, this is obviously important to IT administration. How is this going to work? How am I going to manage all of this? And we've talked a little bit about it already. When we look at Windows 365, enterprise-wise, we're going to be using Microsoft Endpoint Manager to manage these. With business, there's no management portal, again, because it's not designed for large organizations. But many organizations are probably already using Microsoft Endpoint Manager to manage their physical infrastructure as well. So it rolls right into that. Azure Virtual Desktop, everything is handled through the Azure portal. So we're going to deal, whether it's personal or pooled, we'll go through the Azure portal. Operating system wise, you know, Windows 10, Windows 11 Enterprise, single session. That's really the key here with Windows 365, but it makes sense. We don't need multi-session because we're not sharing these machines, right? There's single person or user per machine. Whereas Azure Virtual Desktop, we have a little more flexibility. Windows 10, Windows 11 Enterprise, both single and multi-session, as well as Windows Server. We can deploy Windows Server as a virtual desktop as well. And Adam, don't let me hog it. So whenever you want to jump in, you feel free. Desktop images with Enterprise, you can use either Microsoft-made images or you can do custom images. With business, as Adam has said, I think well in the very beginning, you know, you take it or you leave it, right? This is what we're giving you. This is what you're going to use. There's no custom images. I can't create my own custom image with additional software, things like that. Whereas with Azure Virtual Desktop, I can do both custom and Microsoft provided images. Applications and updates, well, that's going to be handled through Microsoft Endpoint Manager, or you can do it manually as far as the enterprise goes for Windows 365. For business, we do it manual only, so you can be doing through your Windows Update client. Azure Virtual Desktop, we can use either Microsoft Endpoint Manager. We can also use images, right? We can just roll out new images if we choose to go that route. We wait, we update the image, and then we roll out a new image to the session host, right? Or you can use MSIX app attach. And that's really more for applications. This is actually a pretty cool technology. Just as we were talking about FSLogix and how you mount up a VHD that contains your profile, MSIX app attach, if I can say that, is a way to mount up an application. So I don't install it in the image anymore. It's mounted up and it looks like it's installed locally. Really cool technology there.
Mike, if I could just interject. So just two things. One, you know, Mike mentioned early on as we were talking about, hey, how does Microsoft know? How does that analytics thing work? How does that algorithm, that crazy algorithm work to tell us whether we're actually capable of getting that Windows 11 upgrade or not? It's actually having to do with something that's on the screen under monitoring, which is the endpoint analytics. You know, we see a move away from desktop analytics. Those of you managing, as Mike was suggesting, through the endpoint manager and using Windows 10 and enterprise environments are probably familiar with desktop analytics and the capabilities it exposes. Endpoint analytics is that replacement and upgrade for Windows 11. And while we're not using that in the retail space and in the normal channel for everything, elements of that endpoint analytics experience are actually what drive that go or no-go, upgrade or no upgrade decision, and then the phasing around that as Microsoft is rolling that out. So it's kind of interesting. We're seeing that technology emerge and be used in different areas. But Mike, I know we're running a little short on time. We got a whole bunch of people queuing up for questions. Surprising, right? There's so much to talk about. And I know we got a couple of other things we want to get to. So maybe we could wrap this section up. PVR has a couple other questions I know he wants to ask us quickly on about other experience aspects. And then we can probably entertain some questions from our interested audience about all these cool things we're talking about.
Absolutely. And keep in mind, I think Peter mentioned at the very beginning, what we've got here on these slides is all going to be made available to you. So you'll have access to everything here. And yeah, so to wrap this up, before you ask that question, we look at things like backup, monitoring, user profiles, networking on scale. Slight differences there between enterprise and business versus Azure Virtual Desktop. But it comes down to who's managing it, whether or not you have any management capabilities, and because some of it with Azure Virtual Desktop, it's shared environments, slight differences there.
Mike, I did have one quick question on this slide before I move on. You mentioned it's Windows 10/11. Does that mean after October 5th, after the rollout, will I get an option still within these services to use Windows 10 if I wanted to, or is it just going to be all Windows 11 from there?
No, you'll have the option. You'll be able to go in most likely for a little while. They're not ending support for Windows 10 until like 2025 at this point. So when you go in to deploy an image for Azure Virtual Desktop, you currently pick from a list of pre-made images, for example. You can choose Windows 10 multi-session, but you'll be able to choose Windows 11 in the near future. Still not available. I put that on here, but it's not quite available yet. But as Adam mentioned, they're starting to preview some of that, so you can choose that. But it'll just be a choice, but you won't be forced to yet.
Right. That makes sense. So I know we don't have a lot of end users necessarily watching, but the IT admins that are the ones that are going to field the phone calls from those end users. So what does that experience look like for the end user, whether we're using AVD or Windows 365? Is it the exact same because they're just seeing Windows?
Yeah, honestly, this can be a really short one, but because it is pretty much the same, right? The URL slightly different where you connect, but it's the same app. Adam mentioned I think he mentioned that the client that can be installed on our different operating systems. It's the same for both Windows 365, Azure Virtual Desktop. The URL is slightly different, but once you've connected to it, it's a Windows desktop, right? So it really doesn't matter what's underneath from the end user's perspective. Printing is slightly different. There's a couple of options that aren't available for that business, right? That limited one. Self-service is another big one, which is with the Azure Virtual Desktop, I don't have any ability as an end user to restart the VM because I might not be the only session on that VM, whereas the Windows 365, they can go into the portal. If a machine is hung up, a VM is hung up, something like that, they can restart their own VM. With Azure Virtual Desktop, you cannot.
All right, very cool. So last question. I know we talked about the fact that Windows 11 is a free upgrade if you're on Windows 10. What are we talking about price-wise here for licensing and billing? How do these differ?
You want me to take that one, Adam?
Well, either way. So just, with regards to, and everything is relative, right? So big disclaimer, right? No guarantees on what we're about to talk about with regards to pricing and licensing, because clearly it's going to depend, and over time that will change. And it's also localized depending on where you are in the world. But the idea is that basically, if you have an existing subscription or a license, right? So you're already running Windows 10, for instance, as we talked about, well, then we can go ahead and apply those licenses if we have them, or we're lifting and shifting into the cloud. There's always a mechanism for us to do that in some way. So any subscription to a Windows 10 Enterprise or through Microsoft 365 Suite that includes a Windows 10 Enterprise license will allow you, right, to have access to that at some level. Windows 11 kind of slipstreams in there at some point as it releases. With regards to the ability to use the platform, Microsoft has some now current, quote unquote, right, preview information on licensing available in terms of cost and different service tiers. Microsoft as well is changing that as we get closer to release and update of both of these technologies coming out of the betas and the preview tier. So you have to think about that. And Mike suggested there's different fixed hardware capabilities that we can essentially buy or license. You want 32 gigs versus 64 gigs, right? 4 processors versus 8. Those kind of profiling things change the consumption complexity. So it's really hard to pin down what a license looks like. What's better as guidance is to say, and what I tell my customers is, hey, let's talk when you're ready. Let's look at the current licensing SKUs and let's figure out what your service needs are, and then we'll calculate what that looks like. And there's usually a calculation tool we can use to do that, and that's how you're going to figure that out. But productivity from an Office standpoint is the same. You have an Office 365 or M365 license. That translates. Your underlying OS license is built in as part of that, as we suggested, and you're essentially paying an additional as-a-service fee for all the capabilities that Desktop as a Service provides. Whether it's managed fully, somewhat managed, that's really where the difference in price comes in. AVD versus Windows 365.
All right, fantastic. Well, those were all the questions I had, but I know all of you have a ton of questions that we've got here, but still feel free to get them in if you have questions, because we're probably going to go to overtime here in a minute. And if you do ask a question, you'll be entered to win an ITProTV shirt, which we will draw for at the end of the question. So let's go ahead and jump in with our first one. It's from John Z, who's watching in Boone, North Carolina. And John asks, will Microsoft's new cloud-based Windows service replace your gaming PC?
I love that's our first question,
Yeah,
and
of
the answer
course.
would definitely be no. Not yet anyway, right? Hopefully, maybe one day, but no, it's not going to be powerful enough graphic-wise, I don't think, right? But I don't see it replacing your gaming PC anytime soon. Not really what it's designed for.
Well, it depends on the game. If we're talking about Snake and and Minesweeper, sure, that's fine. But
You know, and if you think about it, like some of those with obviously with Windows 365, those images I can't install software. So how do I get Flight Simulator loaded up on those? Right. So it's just not going to be possible. With Azure Virtual Desktop, technically you probably could do some GPU intensive VMs, assign a whole bunch of resources, and maybe throw a game on there. But I'd rather just build my own PC at that point.
makes sense. All right, our next question comes to us from Thomas, who's watching on LinkedIn Live. What's an ideal time frame for learning and certification in Azure 365? So maybe someone that's coming in without much of a background, how long would that ramp-up process be for them?
You know, I think it depends, Thomas, on where you're coming from, right? To the point that was just raised. You know, if you're coming in relatively new in that skill set and learning curve, you know, there's a pretty well-defined path. You would start with either AZ900, which is the Azure fundamentals, or MS900, the Microsoft O365 fundamentals. And then if you certify, you build from there into administration, and then maybe security, and laterally, in this case, into virtual desktop management, things like that. But if you're coming in as an IT professional who's already been working in cloud, maybe not certified, but has depth and breadth in these technologies, and certification may not be your key driver, but skill acquisition is, then it's a question of cherry picking those capabilities. You may go right into the virtual desktop experience and training because you want to really understand how to deploy and manage that technology. So it's a very one-size-fits-one solution. You know, the good news is here at ITProTV, we have those capabilities, those skills, and that training laid out in different paths and modalities for you to consume. And you can mix and match to put that together based on where you start, but ultimately, of course, knowing where you want to finish. And Mike, myself, and all the other edutainers are here to guide you and help you figure it out.
All right, next up we have a question from Trevor, who's watching on the on-air page. Trevor asks, are there enhanced secure boot requirements for Windows 11, for example, VTPM 2.0?
That's a great question. I think you almost answered it with your question, though. The requirements are going to be that you need to be able to support secure boot, and you need TPM 2.0. So your hardware will have to have those capabilities. You know, secure boot is typically something we can enable in our settings on our machine. It has to be UEFI would be another one, but that's part of getting that secure boot, and then TPM version 2. And make sure you have to have that. So those are the things I think that are going to hold most people up when it comes to moving to Windows 11. If you have older hardware, that's where the stick is going to be. Because when you look at like processor, 1 gigahertz, RAM, 4 gigabits, storage, 64 gigabits. So these are the same requirements we saw with Windows 10. And obviously those are minimum requirements. You're not going to be happy with your performance, but you can get it done, right? So the big difference as we move into Windows 11 is not processor and memory requirements. It's that TPM 2.0. And Microsoft has made that because they want to implement more security features that requires that newer hardware, that newer TPM version. They've decided to make that the cut point. And so I know that for a lot of people, that's a pain point because you've got older hardware that now I've got to decide, can I upgrade it? Can I put in, because you can get TPM chips on a card, I believe. We can update that hardware, but do we do that? Is the expense worth it?
Well, the bigger question is, I think also, Mike, not just do we do it, but do we need to do it, right? And I'm not saying what Mike is pointing out is not 100% accurate, because it is. We need those if we're running physical hardware to host a Windows 11 instance. But as Mike and I both know, because we both do this, we're running virtual instances of Windows 11 as well as physical instances. And in the virtual environment, you could be running a virtual TPM and secure boot even if you don't have the capability to do it because you have your own hardware. We've been talking about the fact that with Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365, you don't need your own hardware. All you need is a basic platform, and it could be an older one, to Mike's point, that will support the client, that will access the desktop that is fully provisioned in the cloud, where all those capabilities exist because Microsoft is providing them. So it's a question of being aware of the requirement, but it's also, as we talked about, a question of coming back to the planning and the necessity of owning versus renting, because that's what virtual desktops are all about. You're renting that capability, and you're paying the provider, in this case Microsoft, to give you all of those supporting elements so we don't have to worry about provisioning them. So we definitely have to be aware, but we also need to be not only aware, but smart about making choices about where we spend that money. Do we buy that TPM upgrade chip, or do we put that money into a per month recurring charge to run it on Microsoft's own systems? It's really a question of what you think is best.
All right. Now, Paula, who is over on the on-air page, is kind of addressing the elephant in the room here when it comes to Windows 11. What kinds of features from Windows 10 to 11 are known to, well, break? Because she says there's always got to be something. So is it drivers, or what kinds of things can we look for that might be concerns?
Paula, Windows 11 is perfect, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. Nothing breaks. It's like the best ever operating system put out by Microsoft.
So let me give you the real world answer for that. So all kidding aside, I can tell you from personal experience, Mike and I were chatting about this before we got on air for spending time with you guys, because I run Windows 11 as my primary system to do a lot of our on-air training and demonstrations that we run for our courses here at ITProTV. I have since the day it became available in the Insider Preview track. And I've shared my successes and also dismal failures with Mike along the way. And one of the things that's happening for me, because of the way I run it in Hyper-V on Windows 10. My physical system is a Windows 10 laptop, but I'm running Windows 11 now as an upgrade on that Windows 10 laptop. So I've actually installed it physically, but then I'm also running virtual machines with Windows 11 based on that. And what happens, and the one thing I've noticed that's really a pain point here from Windows 10 to Windows 11, is that because I'm running Insider Preview builds, and this may or may not be you going forward, but it is you now if you've been running Windows 11, Hyper-V and the networking stack tends to become unstable as Microsoft puts out those updates, those interim updates in the Insider Preview build. And as a result of that, I have to uninstall, reinstall Hyper-V and blow away my network stack and reset it every time I get an update pushed. And I run the most aggressive update ring. So I'm running, the Insider Preview builds that are bleeding edge. And so I expect that. But Hyper-V becomes unstable. I have VMs that run, but I can't console into them because the networking stack gets essentially messed up in the upgrade. So that's one thing we've noticed that is actually an issue. But when you go into production, you're not going to be blowing up the operating system every couple of weeks and installing new versions. Microsoft's got a very rigid update schedule that they're committed to. And so you're unlikely to see that kind of disruption. But other than that, Mike wasn't really joking when he said it's been pretty stable. There isn't much that's gone wrong so far, thankfully. We've been pretty happy, I think I could say, at least for me, and I think I'm talking for Mike on this as well. We've both been pretty happy with the results we've seen. And it's been pretty stable for both of us so far.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that. I'm the same way. I'm running Windows 11 Dev on my laptop here. And luckily, I haven't had the same Hyper-V issues. I think a big part is Microsoft learned a lot from rolling out Windows 10. Windows 11 has probably had the biggest Windows Insider program bump that they've ever experienced, I think, because people have been able to join the Windows Insider program and get Windows 11, that beta version, preview on their machine. So they've been able to look at a lot of different installations, combinations of hardware, software, and fix problems. I know one problem I had, I run a Lenovo ThinkPad, and they have some software that controls the noise level, the speed of the fans based on my power plan, balanced, high, low, that kind of thing, which was great because in a show, I don't need my fans ramping up because I can hear them on the microphone. That broke. That whole thing just went away, would not work at all, and that was a real problem for me. But that's third-party software that's being dumped on there, and within a month, they had fixed the problem, right? Lenovo put out an update, and everything is there. So I think to Adam's point, you're not going to be running most likely the dev build or anything like that, or maybe even the preview at all. You're going to be running a stable version of Windows 11, and I don't think you'll have much problems with it.
All right, next up we have a question from Brian, who's on the on-air page. Might just be an alias for Jeff Bezos here, because Brian asks, how does AWS Workspaces stand up against Azure Desktop and Windows 365?
So I'll jump in first because I do a lot of work with both. And I think we could even throw in Workspace ONE from VMware if you want to do a comparison across different platforms, Mr. Bezos or anybody else who may be asking out there. I think it's interesting, right? Because Microsoft is certainly not the, let's blaze a trail to this technology platform when we're talking about AVD and Windows 365. Let's be brutally honest, right? Citrix is the one who figured this out before anybody else, right there with VMware. Over the last 20 years, they've been doing one or more versions of VDI and figuring this out and pioneering this technology way before Microsoft or any of the cloud vendors now like AWS got into this space. And so, to give credit where credit's due, first of all, right, we're late to the party. But having said that, all the major providers, and to be transparent and totally clear about this when I mentioned VMware, Dell now owns VMware, and Dell owns not just VMware, but all of the technology stack that VMware and its supporting ecosystem, including EMC, provide, Carbon Black and all the things that have been acquired recently. So they've got an incredibly strong technology suite as well, very mature and really hyper capable, especially with the addition of Workspace ONE and all the bells and whistles that it brings with it. I think it's fair to say that there's close to equality across all three platforms when we look at comparison of features. But I think the thing that's really compelling that makes Microsoft's reimagined and re-envisioned offering what we now think of as AVD and Windows 365, because Mike, you'll remember, this is not the first bite at the apple, right? As you suggested, that Microsoft's had in this space. We've had VDI solutions going all the way back to MedV and some of the really early VDI solutions that Microsoft tried that just never really went anywhere, right? And the reality is, I think now what's different and compelling is you've got a mature cloud ecosystem that allows us to offload all of these capabilities and get them out of the technology stack on premises. And as we talked about, make them almost exclusively fully managed or perhaps in a hybrid environment, semi-managed by the provider with oversight from us in IT. And while AWS gives us that, VMware gives us that as well in some way, I think Microsoft has really gone down the center of the road. They've picked the core OSs that everybody wants to run. They developed the platform to support it, integrated into environments that most of us are familiar with and running already. And they've made it seamless for us to onboard the majority of our users that are out there in different verticals: consumer, home, retail, education, you name it. Everybody can get into this platform over the next 2 to 3 years as their turn comes up and their business requires it. And the cost of entry is pretty minimal. Even if you're buying new hardware, which you have to do anyway, it's pretty small. And most companies probably not even going to worry about buying new hardware. They're simply going to envision running this on top of hardware platforms that already exist that meet those requirements using virtual desktops. And as a result, it's really a no-brainer solution because it's the easy button solution. Whereas something with AWS, something with VMware, you got to have depth in that stack. You got to own that infrastructure. You got to know how to port Microsoft to it. And while that's become a lot easier, it's also still not as easy as doing it directly from the source, right, with Microsoft itself. And I think that's the reason a lot of companies ultimately go this route. It's easier to have one technology vendor than it is to have 2 or 3 you have to integrate in order to get the solution everybody in your organization wants.
That makes sense. All right, our next question is from Richard, who comes from your neck of the woods down there in Miami, Florida, Adam. Richard asks, is it recommended to migrate some PCs to Windows 11 and still keep others running Windows 10 at the enterprise level? Is there any benefit to that?
There's always a benefit, right, in having different operating systems running. On one side of the argument, we could say, well, yeah, we definitely have backwards compatibility, so we can run older apps. We have perhaps a need to be able to, for customer support, have those machines available because we have issues that we have to address. But there's also liability, right? You've got, eventually over time, Mike suggested earlier in our discussion that Windows 10 support, at least currently, this date may change as we get closer, is scheduled to end of life around 2025. We saw this with Windows 7. It kept getting pushed out because businesses just held on so tightly and refused to migrate that Windows 7 couldn't be pulled from active support because of the security implications of having a majority of the systems globally deployed running an OS that is not currently security patched and supported in an ongoing way. And so I think there's benefit, but there's also risk associated with that. What I tell my customers is, plan now, today, in the next 6 months, the next year, for where you want to be 2 to 3 years down the road with regards to hardware and software. meaning don't keep running Windows 10 because you haven't thought about what it means to run Windows 11. Run Windows 10 knowing you need to move to Windows 11, and let's have a plan to do that, because at some point Windows 10 is no longer viable. And if we don't plan now, we're going to be part of that 2/3 of the majority of users that don't have a plan as end of life approaches. And the security implications that we saw with Windows 7 can be catastrophic for organizations. So I do think you need to plan, especially in industries like healthcare, like insurance, like finance, where at best technology moves slowly because of regulatory issues. And it can take 2 to 3 years for vendors to figure out that they need to backfill that backwards requirement for Windows 10 in their software with a forward-looking solution that runs in Windows 11. And if you don't start planning and pushing your vendors now, you're probably going to be on the wrong end of that conversation.
Yeah, and I'll even add to that, what Adam was just saying there. It's always a good idea if you were to roll this out to your entire enterprise at once, Windows 11. You planned it, whatever, and the rollout goes well, but you haven't had a chance to test it right in your environment, because no matter how much testing Microsoft does, your environment is unique to you, the software you run, the combinations of things that you do. And so you really want a chance to test that out before you roll out to everybody, right? You want to have that canary group that you assign this to that's good at giving feedback, that uses their machine in many different ways, power users, things like that, so that you can give them a chance to find the breaks, find the bugs, find the things that don't work in your enterprise, so that you can work those out before you roll it out to the entire operation. So definitely want to do, in my opinion, I always do a little bit of a test group first, just to give you that ability to find, or that visibility into what might or might not work after you do that rollout. And as far as Windows 10 and Windows 11 working along together, there's nothing to worry about there. If part of your enterprise is running Windows 11, part of Windows 10, you're not going to have any issues.
All right, fantastic. All right, Mike. Well, stay tuned as we're going to announce the winner of the ITProTV t-shirt in just a moment. But don't worry, if we couldn't get to your questions, Adam and Mike will be answering them in overtime on the ITProTV on-air page after the webinar. I'll explain more about that in just a moment. All right, you can check out a free ITProTV membership with no credit card required, with access to select courses and our daily live feed. You can also get a full personal membership that provides complete access to all the ITProTV courses with or without practice exams and virtual labs. Now, if you're on a team, you'll want to check out the business page, which offers a tour of the Pro Portal that's used to maximize your team's investment in training. Don't forget to enter the promo code webinar30 when you sign up for an ITProTV membership to get 30% off the lifetime of your personal membership. All right, now for the winner of the t-shirt. The winner is actually who we were talking about there. It is Richard in Miami. So Richard, congratulations. We will reach out to you and drop you an email and get you a t-shirt. So congratulations, well done. And all right, so we've run out of time here for this webinar, but we still have, like I said, some more questions from you that we'd love to answer. So we're going to go into overtime, which is on the ITProTV on-air page, so we can continue answering those questions. But this is for ITProTV members only. You can become a member today for no cost by signing up for a free membership now. One of our team members will put the link in the chat for you. It's quick and it's simple. So we're going to take a 5-minute break now to give you some time to sign up, and we'll see you over there. But before we go, Adam and Mike, any closing thoughts before we head over to overtime?
Vote for NT4 pinball.
I'm still going with Chip's Challenge.
Perfect closing thoughts. All right, everybody, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in overtime in just a few moments.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you for joining us today. You will receive a link to a recording of the webinar delivered to your inbox. Remember that coupon code is webinar30. See you back here for the next ITProTV webinar.